And thanks everybody for coming. Today's talk is Sound Ecology, the environmental effects of mechanical noise in human music. And I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the problem. It's a little bit different than a lot of the talks that I've attended here, where you start out with a very clear problem and sometimes less clear solutions. In this case, the problem even isn't as...
1 second. Since the microphone when you're here, it's too bassy.
Too busy.
Bassy.
Bassy, okay.
Now it's good.
I could try high raised pitch. In fact, that fits perfectly into what I'm about to talk about. I'm going to start by arguing, and I think it's almost axiomatic, that in the humanities and social sciences, the sound has been somewhat of an oversight compared to visual, textual, and other sorts of data and evidence and focus. However, I won't necessarily make that claim in science, but I think ornithologists might say so differently. Now, I'm going to commit 2 cardinal sins today, and the first one is science without a license. But part of the courage to do this came from being a resident fellow at the IonE, where I've seen the opposite quite often and done fairly well, where a lot of scientists doing social science and even semiotics and doing an expert job of it. So one of the very points of this talk is going to be the need to, for example, bring anthro back into the Anthropocene to understand the human elements at some level in order to be truly ecological, in this case around sound. So let's look a little bit of what we know, and in some ways this is equally to say what is it we don't know. Several bird species appear to increase in volume in loud urban environments, and some increase frequency, what we perceive as pitch, as well. For example, one of my favorite names for a bird, it sounds like something out of Monty Python, the Turdus merula. The frequency and amplitude are strongly positively correlated in the common blackbird. Now notice the 2013 there, and many of you maybe have seen the headlines about birds shouting in urban environments. Well, one of the reasons why this is still surprising in 2013, that one of the easiest to study and one of the loudest birds, finally, we can say almost for certain that these two things do co-vary, is because it's hard to measure, frankly. And so later on, when I talk about the other things we need to measure, keep that in mind as far as the difficulty of doing this. So for example, before that data came out in the latest Nemeth et al. Study, they had actually said we couldn't quite see that covariance yet. And Slavicorn et al. Took some of the data and said, well, at least we can say this. In a forest context, the low-pitched songs will travel further than in the urban context, where they find that the high-pitched songs travel further. So at least we had that. But now we have the fact that the blackbirds do, in fact, increase their pitch and volume. So when you see those headlines, you kind of have to think, okay, we know that about the blackbird. Do we know that birds in general do this? Well, not necessarily, but it is a fairly clear supposition that that probably does take place. And then for other birds that are not songbirds, it appears that they're fairly acclimated to sound, and only at the very high levels that disturb humans quite a bit too is it an issue. Now, is that to say that, therefore, birds aren't affected by loud sounds? Probably not able to say that, because most of the birds that would be very bothered in urban contexts are probably eliminated from that urban context. So we're studying the types of birds that are more accessible in urban contexts in order to study them. It's probably clearer in whales that communication is disrupted by anthropogenic noise. For example, right whales have been shown to increase their noise in noisy contexts, those with a lot of sonar and propeller noise and that kind of thing. Orca whales have also been shown to do this. And why does that matter? Well, of course, it can affect reproduction and especially foraging. So that if you have these sounds, those things can be disrupted in these various species. And several whale species have even been demonstrated to pause, stop their foraging, just stop when there's loud sonar coming into their environment. And of course, there's also studies of frogs and even moths that have demonstrated that sound is negatively affecting foraging and reproduction. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. But I want to talk about the human element as well, We often think of noise as that we're acclimated to that kind of thing, but when you consider this statistic from Dark Side of the Tune, 500,000 UK residents every year are moving due to noise. When we think of that as an environmental, material, ecological question, right there you see that noise is affecting people greatly in ways that we sort of almost take for granted. And 80% of that is noise. 80% of that noise is music. So even the sounds that we assume are good are often things that are causing us to act in various negative ways. I want to point you to, as far as looking at the physiological, psychological, and to a certain extent sociological effects of noise, I want to point you to a TED Talk by Julian Treasure. And rather than repeat that here, I would suggest that as shorthand. He actually plays noises and shows what they do physiologically to people and why it is a problem. So I'll send you to that. But a work I want to talk about that was extremely influential in my own thinking about the issue of sound and environment comes from Gordon Hempton. And he's a recording engineer that, like many of us that have grown up as early adopters of Walkman, etc., has tinnitus in his ears and can't completely hear. And he's made a living of recording natural sound and selling it. So it's particularly glaring in his case that this would be a problem. But it led him to realize that it's not just a matter of how sound affects us, but the fact that we can't listen to environments might be affecting how we preserve them. So, for example, some of the noisiest areas in terms of airplane overflights, are wilderness zones and national parks, because they're actually fairly easy in some cases to zone for overflights. He is particularly concerned with the Olympic Peninsula, where you have a lot of overflights, and therefore you almost can never get natural sound that has no mechanical noise. And his idea is if you could take a talisman to the middle of the Hoh rainforest and put it there and not hear any human noise, then maybe you can think about it as a wilderness. And he points out that once you've lost that kind of natural sound or wilderness, it's really hard to know what it is you have lost. So bringing sound back into the issue. Now, the last one I want to mention as far as some of the academic background of what we do or don't know is Irvine et al. And I thought this was a fairly fascinating study. They look at 4 things independently: green spaces and other spaces in an urban environment, the spaces that people prefer to be in or not. And the third one is biodiversity, so they measure biodiversity in these various spaces. And the fourth is sound. And they found indeed that these things did co-vary. People preferred to be in the green spaces. These green spaces were quieter, had more natural sound than other places, and were more biodiverse. So we immediately see how, at least as cipher or surrogate, sound can become a way to understand biodiversity and get towards it. And that's going to be one of the main points as I move in on the talk. Before I get there, though, I wanted to say a little bit about sound studies and specifically thinking about music as it relates to this issue so that you can see my own intersection into it. And one of the things that I've been coming to more and more is recognizing that something like music, which we take to be esoteric, ephemeral, expressive, is in fact not just a representation of issues. So within music you see reflections of various types of social modes and even of ecosystems. It's also something that's incredibly productive. To cut to the chase, it's hard to imagine any meaningful collective human activity that does not involve music. And that includes everything from environmental activism to what I'll talk about in a second, and that is the issue of entrainment. So based on 8 years of research, I recently published this book, Ecomusicology, Rock, Folk, and the Environment. And I'm not going to talk much about that today. I'm really starting to move on. But I want to mention it just briefly to talk about my own intersection and this issue. In a way, what I was doing by studying music in relation to the environment was something that's very old. In 1838, William Gardner published the very first book on music and the environment. And it's called The Music of Nature. And I just have to read this subtitle to you. Or an attempt to prove that what is passionate and pleasing in the art of singing, speaking, and performing upon musical instruments is derived from the sounds of the animated world with curious and interesting illustrations. They loved their prepositions. But what he was doing was basically what's been done for the most part in classical musicology since. Studies of the ways in which classical music in particular reflects the natural world. But I wanted to do something a little bit different in what I was studying, and I think it's a move that you're starting to see more and more in sound studies, including in eco-criticism and ecomusicology. And that is not to just look at music and sound as reflection, but to try to understand it truly ecologically, and therefore as it relates to material systems as well. Now, this is going to be a horribly roundabout tour just to give you an idea of what's in the book so that we can segue then to something very specific. At the global level, one of the things I was interested in is the ways in which the very thing that was seen as progressive in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, the mega benefit phenomenon, Live Aid, etc., is now sort of the environmental bad guy. From U2 to Live Earth, and Live Earth's failure was caused out for issues of hypocrisy, contradiction, of unsustainable touring methods. So at the global level, you see that reflected, the ways in which music becomes an issue in relation to global superstars and touring. I also look at the way in which our national songs reflect very different, even contests over what the nation is in terms of a natural space, including Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land. And also look at the way in which the fate of our public music has paralleled the fate of our public lands, public water, the privatization, the move towards sort of libertarianism on one hand, and then the sort of commodification of everything, including music, has in some ways changed, in other ways limited what we do with music in relation to our national environment. Now, jumping ahead to the very last chapter, it's based on ethnography. I got together, as an ethnographer, I wanted to get together with experts, real musicians, and performed in Washington State, Minnesota, and elsewhere in order to try to understand what is probably the most difficult connection given the way in which we distribute and deal with music now. And that is, how do we connect to our own local environments? Because music's always been central to that. And what does it mean when very little of our music in any way reflects, responds to, connects us to local systems? So I performed a lot with a band called the Hypoxic Punks, and we, to try to, in the fourth chapter, I talk about ways in which trying to reintegrate the idea of connecting us to local environments. The final one I want to talk about, and to give an idea and a little bit more segue to the more literal and material aspects of music in relationship to environments, is the case of Woody Guthrie and his work on the regional level in the Pacific Northwest with the Bonneville Power Administration. Woody Guthrie was part and parcel of the PR in order to bring the dams to that area. And it was seen as a given that, of course, it was going to be progressive to take the power out of large landholders, bankers, and others, and be able to bring power, literally, to small farmers. Well, that didn't work out so well. But the other thing that didn't work out as a consequence is many of you know about the effect that these over 100 dams have had on salmon runs. 16 species of salmon extinct because of them. And even more importantly, the energy cycling through that area that takes it all the way into Idaho and northern Nevada is basically ended, stopped by these dams. And all sort of artificial attempts through hatcheries and others to keep it alive have not worked too well. And so now, for the most part, there's a movement to take down as many of these dams as is possible. And unfortunately, it won't be possible to take down many of them. There's also, of course, the other issue of fairly clean power. So you see, music was central to that. Did music cause that? No. But it was a central part of instituting this very different way of experiencing the natural world in the Pacific Northwest. And we could give any number of other examples. And then finally, how we listen to music changes with radically different importance in terms of the natural world as well. So that was my own intervention, looking at music not just as a representation of the world, but the ways it literally fit into movements and ecosystems. One of the most important names for those of you that are not familiar with sound studies would be R. Murray Schafer, Canadian, who, thanks to him, Simon Fraser and the Sound Labs are, and will be for a long time, ground zero of soundscape studies. One of the reasons I mention R. Murray Schafer is he's one of those examples where academic study really has had an incredible impact in the real world, if you will. Landscape designers, architects, and others have integrated concepts of soundscape designs that have really originated with R. Murray Schafer that have been fairly successful. Which brings me to a collaboration I've been involved with around ecomusicology that I find extremely promising. Bridget mentioned the Ecomusicology Listening Room. And what this was is I was asked to direct this by a group of musicologists in the American Musicological Society and ethnomusicologists in the Society for Ethnomusicology, and working with them and soundscape folks, really trying to think about how can we bring more interdisciplinary groups together in order to study these issues. And what we came up was the Ecomusicology Listening Room. Over 100 people came to it in New Orleans, where we would look at images, listen to sound, and then have a freewheeling discussion around questions that could bring together interdisciplinary teams. And if you're interested in seeing that, the physical exhibit part of that is in the Commons, as Bridget mentioned, or you can go to ecosong.org. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning is I'd love it if people could give feedback, because really that is not just sort of a show and tell display. It's been a way that we're starting to think about building a field. So moving from a very general view of what's the problem with sound, how might it be affecting animals, how is it affecting humans, to soundscape studies and what are some other people doing around these issues, I want to now start focusing down to a more specific problem. And one of the ways I want to do that is talk about a concept that I think is one of those that gives us a point at which people can enter from a number of different disciplines. First, I will recommend this book. Many of you probably know it. This is Your Brain on Music by Daniel Levitin. It's been a bestseller, and it's an excellent study of the state of the neuroscience of dealing with music at this point, and brings in a bit of paleobiology as well. One of the issues that Levitin deals with that I think is extremely promising for thinking about sound in terms of ecosystem is that of entrainment. Now, entrainment is one of those simple things, it seems, from a human perspective that is extremely profound. All it is the ability of organisms to synchronize in or to rhythm. And let's think about that for just a minute. There's other animals that can do this at sort of a simple level. But human beings have that ability to literally be on the same beat at the same time in the same place in a very complex way. And in fact, it is so central to our behavior that Levitin and others argue that there must have been at least some evolutionary function to this, or at least as a byproduct of other forms of communication. Almost nothing integrates as many of the brain's functions as music, and in fact, when people are making music together, their physiological states, as measured in terms of brain activity, start to sync in certain ways. And so we're just studying this issue. And when you think about it sociologically, how central music is to literally getting everybody on the same beat, for better or for worse. And therefore, we can think about the ramifications for sound, because often this is subconscious. Like nobody, I think, at a Nazi rally would say it was the music or the sound that made me so excited. It was Hitler, right? But that's one of the powers of sound. Just as you shut off a soundtrack, the movie doesn't feel the same, and you turn it back on, it has that feeling, emotive power, and we recognize we can't shut our ears. So entrainment, the idea that we can be in the same beat at the same moment, and it's one of the few things that capture that sense of the ineffable present. Not the past, not the future, but we're in the same place at the same time together, has incredible power. So I mentioned a negative example there in passing. I want to mention a positive example of sound used in that regard, and that is the Raging Grannies. They're a group of older women in Victoria, Canada, who are trying to stop the United States Navy from bringing in nuclear-powered ships to their ports. It was destroying local ecosystems, but also represents the possibility for global catastrophe. Nobody was listening to them, not only in government, but also in the environmental movement. So what they did is take the stereotype by which they're marginalized, blow it up and make it into a parody, and they've been successful ever since. On the West Coast, they're particularly successful. Raging Granny's gaggles still exist in Vancouver, Victoria, San Francisco, Seattle, but also in places like Australia and Israel. There's Raging Granny's chapters all over. So they use music as central to their environmental movement still today. So this little idea of entrainment is a possibility where we can see everything from how our brain operates to how we operate socially together. Okay, the last thing I want to mention, though, is sort of the punchline here before I end up with just 2 or 3 minutes on what can we do about sound now based on what we know, is this idea of filling in the black box. I think with sound, as with so many things, we're not really able to grasp this anthropological part of the Anthropocene, if we can call it that, the era of humanity and its impact on the natural systems. And it's really important to do so. So let's look at sound studies, for example. For the most part, sound studies, when it relates to ecosystems more explicitly, has been to measure some sort of anthropogenic noise. And that's not easy. Even that alone, a reductionist study of this is not easy. And then look at the effects by measuring animal sound. And you already saw at the very beginning how much we have to learn still about that. So what I'm asking here is, to a certain extent, the impossible, because as Kite et al. Bring us, we don't even really know exactly how sound works physiologically within an organism in many cases, to be able to extrapolate from that data about other effects like foraging and reproduction to think about how the physiology of it actually works. So given that, it's a little bit unfair for me to even point this out, but what about that great big black box of the anthropogenic? What is it that's causing this noise and doing all of this? And I think that's where social scientists and humanists, we need to step up a little bit more and study sound and find out what is causing all the noise. So if we imagine, so I'll just represent it in sort of signs, all the different ways in which we can study and think about production of noise. I just mentioned one, for example, that organizational chart to represent the way in which institutions, for the most part, are the producers of noise. Yet we have a sort of assumption, we think at the individual level. It's almost, I think, ideologically we're drawn to think about what do individuals do. We really, it's hard to understand an entire sound system if we don't also include, if we don't just black boxes, but also think about the ways in which those anthropogenic elements often overwhelm and overdetermine the rest of the material system. And that's a little bit depressing when we think about it, because it's hard enough to deal reductively with that material system without thinking about the thing that keeps, like I say, overdetermining it. And so the second cardinal sin I'm going to commit here at the very end of the talk is to talk to you not about the research I've been doing for the past many years, but a perspective study where I would like to start getting at that sense of a more holistic, systemic, and relational understanding of human noise in relationship to animal noise. And that's one of the reasons why I am very glad that there's a lot of experts on sound in here to tell me where I'm probably going wrong on this. Just very briefly to tell you about the study that I've started. I've gotten IRB clearance and the state parks in Washington are very excited about it, but I haven't really started it. I spend my summers now, instead of Latin America, in a little place, Orcas Island, in a very undeveloped corner of it. And I've realized it's a perfect sound lab, including a lot of comparative, if you did a 12-mile transect here, you've got a very developed Rosario resort with a lot of condos, and you have a very undeveloped small housing area here that will not develop further for reasons I won't go into. So you have that comparison. You have 2 lakes, one with a road that goes right through it, campgrounds all around it, versus a lake, mountain lake, which they purposely try to make sure is not visited as much. You have 2 peaks, both around 2,000 feet, one of which has a tourist overlook atop of it, and it's a fairly noisy place. You have another one that virtually nobody visits. I spend a lot of time there, and there's almost nobody ever there. there's other comparative environments there. And one of the things I would love to do, and it's probably not something that will happen quickly, although I think the first year's data will produce something, but over a long period of time, is try to see how some of these variables that have not been considered could be considered in such a study. To look at sonic amplitude and frequency of both human noise in these various comparative domains, but also the animal sound in those various domains, to think about how they might affect diversity. But also as that relates to material footprint. In the park, is somebody bringing in an RV and generators, or are they bringing in tents? And how might park officials be able to use that data in order to think about the ways that they create policies for impact? And then finally, demographic data, and most clearly that would be population density, because all of these I think we can infer have something to do with biodiversity, and see if the fact that we can learn something about an environment like that, albeit in this case a very rural area, that might help set policy around sound, which is only really, in terms of the park systems, are they only now really starting to think about sound policies. So what can we do? That was sort of a travel log through some sound issues, a prospective study that I'm really just starting. But fortunately, there are some things I think we can do now based on what we do know. First one I'm going to recommend is fairly esoteric, but it's had, I think, some fairly powerful ramifications. In the area of Vancouver, Washington, is where the sound walk movement started, but there's people that do this in the Twin Cities area as well. If you're ever in Vancouver, I recommended Tyler Kinnear, who takes people on what are called sound walks, where they walk together fairly quietly and then afterwards talk about what they heard, to try to reintegrate the idea of sound into understanding of environments, because we do tend to be so visual. Not to be mistaken with sound walks that are in museums and consumers and that kind of thing. But another one that really strikes me, and you'll notice a lot of my examples come out of the Pacific Northwest, is the way in which in so many scoping procedures, environmental impact statements, and hearings, sound is neglected, and often that's to our detriment. Take the example of Cherry Point in Bellingham, where there's a dispute right now over a coal terminal for shipping coal to China, a prospective coal terminal. Out of all of the testimony that was given, sound was almost never mentioned, even though it could be a major impact in terms of sound in an area where orcas travel, where it's been demonstrated that there are various effects. And so within a public hearing, it is very powerful in cases where citizens do bring up questions of sound. And then, of course, there's things that we can do, planting trees to stop noise pollution, but also to produce. One of the Julian Treasure's points is that bird sound is extremely soothing. It does good things for people. And so producing more bird habitat, for example, is one thing. I had my students go out and do a sound measurements around, just around the area of Ford Hall and the mall and other places. And one of the first things they came back with it was the recommendation that more foliage would improve the soundscape dramatically. And of course, not neglecting the idea of music. When we have something like a climate rally, music is going to be central to having positive action. Finally, the last thing I want to do is I want to put out a call. I'm teaching environmental communication courses at Ford Hall. And they tend to be communication studies students with a few sustainability studies and others. I'd love to increase the diversity of those classes, because I think one of the things that I'm trying to point out here is the more interdisciplinary this study is, the more robust it'll be, the more we can learn, and therefore the more we can do interventions that really matter around soundscapes. And so that concludes the talk. Thank you.